There is a darkness to crowds. Being in a crowd can be transformative. Ideas and emotions in a crowd are contagious.
Then it happened. Somebody, I don't know, threw something and it was on after that.
Human beings are evil in that they have an inherent capacity for destruction and cruelty. And the only reason why we don't all start killing each other is because, for the individual, a lot of that darkness is concealed and contained beneath layers upon layers of psychological barriers. Whenever you are angry or frustrated at your surroundings, what keeps you from going on a destructive rampage of Hobbesian proportions might be a number of factors, such as morality and social norms, an evolutionary-driven desire to fit into the herd, risk of retaliation, and of course an awareness of the likely consequences of destructive actions, with perhaps a little bit of empathy in there somewhere as well. These are some of the many reasons why you're not currently in a violent conflict with your neighbor, and none of these barriers to evil should be underestimated. They are what makes society function somewhat normally. But how does the evil and destructive nature of an individual then come to break these barriers and manifest themselves? The answer? Through other people. In this video, I will dive into the dark psychology of crowds and through the works of one of the greatest social thinkers of all time. Taking departure from a number of eerie examples throughout human history, I will seek to demonstrate how, from the berserkers of the Icelandic sagas, the groupthink madness of Nazi Germany, to any violent protest of contemporary society, there is scarcely anything more dangerous to an individual than a group of individuals.
Alright, this is getting serious. Oh my goodness.
Capitol Police 1 advised they're trying to breach and get to the Capitol.
You're a human being, so you probably recognize this feeling. You are standing in the middle of a crowd, and it almost seems like the atmosphere of that setting makes you forget where and even who you are for a brief moment. The way that the nature of the crowd, the group, the mob simply drags you in. The way that you seem to become infected by the collective emotion of the crowd, whether it's anger at a political demonstration, the will to evil when you for once stand among the bullies rather than the bullied, or the euphoria when your team wins the game. Everybody laughing, cheering, crying, yelling, including you. And then afterwards had to ask yourself, what just happened? Why did I just do that? That's not me at all. Throughout history, many great thinkers have sought to describe and explain the nature of the masses. For instance, Sigmund Freud extended his psychoanalytic theory to group behavior, suggesting that crowds form around a powerful leader and operate based on the principles of the libido. Wilfred Trotter, in his work Instincts of the Herd in Peace and War from 1916, proposed that herd behavior is an inherent characteristic of human societies, driven by instinctual forces. And of course, Charles Mackay, who in Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds from 1841 explored the crowd psychology behind economic bubbles, witch hunts, and other mass phenomena, highlighting the irrationality and madness that can sometimes grip society. However, every time we discuss the psychology of the masses, there is one brilliant thinker that deserves some extra attention. Gustave Le Bon, the father of crowd psychology, in his seminal work The Crowd, A Study of the Popular Mind from 1895, posited that individuals in a crowd lose their sense of self and rationality, becoming susceptible to suggestion and contagion. If you've seen my video on the banality of evil, you have probably already heard me mention Le Bon, but here I'm going to go even deeper. Deeply affected by some of the things he witnessed in France in the late 19th century, the Franco-Prussian War, as well as the rise and fall of the Paris Commune in particular, he argued that crowds operate on a primitive emotional level, often leading to irrational and destructive behaviors. And this crowd madness that Le Bon describes has been with mankind for as long as records exist. One example, around 700 BC, the so-called Dionysian mysteries began to appear in ancient Greece, and they serve as a textbook example of the dark nature of crowds. As a reaction to the Apollonian discipline and moderation which had dominated ancient Greek society, the Dionysian mysteries were religious rites dedicated to the Greek god Dionysus, the deity of wine, fertility, and ecstasy. The Maenads, the female followers of Dionysus, often depicted in myth and art as wild, frenzied women, and often portrayed as engaging in orgiastic rituals, tearing animals, or in some myths even humans, apart in a state of divine madness, represents the potential for violence and irrationality inherent in uncontrolled group dynamics. Other historical instances like the dancing plague of 1518, where people started to dance uncontrollably for days, or the Salem Witch Trials, where fear and hysteria about witchcraft spread rapidly, are examples of mass hysteria where individuals, once in groups, start engaging in seemingly irrational behavior. Now, according to Le Bon's theory, a crowd has its own nature, distinct from the sum of its individual members. When entering a crowd, an individual undergoes a process of de-individuation, where all of the norms, values, and morality, as well as other types of emotions such as fear, that would otherwise guide a person's behavior become suppressed, and the will of the group becomes the dominant behavioral driver. Le Bon himself stated that, isolated, he may be a cultivated individual. In a crowd, he's a barbarian. That is, a creature acting by instinct. He possesses the spontaneity, the violence, the ferocity, and also the enthusiasm and heroism of primitive beings. The berserkers of Norse mythology, mentioned in the Icelandic sagas, serve as an example of this. These warriors, linked to the god Odin, were famous for their fighting style, characterized by a trance-like fury known as berserkergang. This state was marked by a wild, uncontrollable rage that both terrified their enemies and has greatly fascinated later generations. During this state, they were said to exhibit extraordinary strength and endurance, becoming seemingly immune to pain, and they would often fight without regard for their own safety. The psychological transformation involved in berserkergang could be seen as a form of self-hypnosis or intense focus, tapping into primal strength and aggression. Lastly, according to Le Bon, the collective mind of a crowd is characterized by contagion, in that ideas spread like a virus among its members. The Salem Witch Trials, a notorious episode in early American history, provide a stark example of this. These trials, which took place in Salem, Massachusetts in 1692, involved the accusation, trial, and execution of several people on charges of witchcraft. This event is often cited as an instance of mass hysteria, where seemingly irrational fears and beliefs spread contagiously through a community. It began with a few young girls exhibiting strange behaviors and symptoms. These girls claimed to be possessed by the devil and accused several local women of witchcraft. This marked the beginning of a series of witchcraft accusations. The initial accusations acted as a catalyst for further allegations, and the fear of witchcraft and the devil worked as a contagious force spreading rapidly through the community. The theocratic nature of Salem, where religious and civil authorities were deeply intertwined, played a significant role in amplifying the hysteria, and the ministers and magistrates took the accusations seriously and initiated formal proceedings. The religious passion and the strong belief in the supernatural among the Puritans made the community particularly susceptible to the contagion of witchcraft fears. The sermons of local ministers emphasizing the threat of the devil contributed to the spreading hysteria. The trials created an environment of fear and suspicion. Neighbors began accusing each other, often to settle old scores or out of fear of being accused themselves. As more people were accused and arrested, the panic escalated. The trials ceased to be about individual cases of witchcraft and became a collective expression of the community's fears and moral panic. Of course, the witch trials were not confined to Salem village, but spread to surrounding areas, as the contagion of fear and paranoia did not recognize geographical boundaries. The Salem witch trials serve as a historical example of how fear, paranoia, and irrational beliefs can contagiously spread through a community, leading to tragic consequences. Likewise, the French Revolution, which began in 1789, was also marked by a contagion of ideas. Enlightenment philosophies challenging the established social and political order resonated with a broad segment of society. These ideas, emphasizing liberty, equality, and fraternity, spread rapidly, creating a unified sentiment against the monarchy and aristocracy. And of course, the contagious nature of these ideas was amplified by the use of pamphlets, newspapers, and public speeches, which acted as mediums to rapidly spread the revolutionary thoughts among the masses. However, during the French Revolution, we also, of course, saw the rise of the Reign of Terror, where extreme revolutionary passion and paranoia spread throughout France. The fear of counter-revolutionary forces and the desire to protect the gains of the revolution led to a mass hysteria, culminating in widespread arrests and executions. The guillotine became a symbol of this period, with public executions becoming events that drew large, emotionally charged crowds. This period highlights how fear and suspicion can become contagious, leading to an atmosphere where rational thinking is overshadowed by collective madness. Of course, once again, none of this is tied to a specific event or period in human history. It's occurring all the time, including recent times. For instance, when participating in political rallies or demonstrations, individuals may become more impassioned and engage in behaviors they might not consider in a different setting. Situations of panic, such as during natural disasters or crises, such as the recent COVID-19 pandemic, stock market movements, just like the GameStop short squeeze in early 2021 or the crash of 2008, all serve as examples of how a collective hype, as well as fear and anxiety, can spread rapidly among people. And then, of course, we have textbook examples just like these. The images of chaos, violence, and insurrection that unfolded on the 6th of January 2021 were both unprecedented and deeply troubling. Emotions movements and actions among the crowd became contagious, with individuals easily influenced by the mood and actions of those around them, which was evident in the escalation of the event from a rally to a violent storming of Capitol Hill. The same of course goes for the Black Lives Matter riots in May 2020,
which were largely peaceful demonstrations.
The immediate and intense emotional response to George Floyd's death acted as a catalyst, triggering widespread anger and frustration. What started as local protests quickly grew into a global movement. The pervasive media coverage and the role of social media in spreading images and videos played a significant role in this, allowing people from different regions to engage with the movement, both emotionally and behaviorally. And of course, as predicted by Le Bon's theory, the Black Lives Matter protests saw a rapid spread of anger, frustration, and defiance, leading to an escalation in the intensity of demonstrations. The riots that followed demonstrated how contagion can lead to a situation where the behavior of one or a few individuals is quickly mimicked by others, escalating peaceful protests into violent confrontations. Now, I've spent some time talking about crowds as if they were completely self-driving, as if just by standing in the midst of a group of people you somehow, completely out of nowhere, start engaging in violent and destructive behavior. And as most of us probably know from experience, this is not necessarily the case. Instead, we have to ask ourselves, as always when dealing with something that has to do with human beings or social arenas, is it really that simple? And as we shall see in a moment, of course not. Imagine having to light a fire. You need several things to make that happen. You need a flammable material, you need oxygen, and you need heat. More precisely, you need a spark to ignite the fire. Of course, none of these things alone can produce fire. And the truth is, this same thing is the case with the destructive nature of crowds. In 2015, Hopkins et al. Studied the religious festival of Marc Millar, seeking to investigate why these massive gatherings of people did not seem to produce a violent outcome. What they concluded from interviewing hundreds of participants was that the reason for why crowds form in the first place is an extremely important predictor of when crowd behavior actually ends up in violence. In other words, context matters. If a crowd forms as a result of a perceived injustice or because of social grievances, the likelihood of aggression is obviously significantly higher than if crowds form for the purpose of attending a concert or for the sake of buying Christmas presents at the local mall. Another, and perhaps the most important factor, was identified by Le Bon himself, namely the role of charismatic leaders in influencing crowd behavior. He believed that these leaders could shape the direction and actions of a crowd, particularly in inciting aggressive or extreme behavior by appealing to emotions, simplifying messages, and repeating ideas. His work suggested that crowds could be easily manipulated by leaders who understood how to exploit the psychological dynamics of groups. Now, the truth is, studying totalitarian leaders over time, this appears obvious. And Le Bon's insights into the psychology of crowds, the power of emotions, and the role of charismatic leadership in directing the behavior of groups clearly align with some of the methods used by dictators to mobilize and manipulate masses for their political agendas.
Shall we vote?
As always, Adolf Hitler serves as a textbook example of this. Le Bon emphasized that in a crowd, emotions often take precedence over rational thought. And of course, Hitler's propaganda heavily relied on emotional appeal rather than factual accuracy or logical argumentation. Le Bon also suggested that crowds tend to follow a strong leader who can appeal to their emotions. And again, Hitler's charismatic oratory and his ability to tap into the fears and aspirations of the German people were central to his rise to power. Furthermore, crowds are highly suggestible and can be influenced by repeated messages. And Nazi propaganda extensively used repetition and striking imagery to instill its ideology. Lastly, Le Bon noted that when in a group, individuals tend to lose their personal identity and adopt the group identity. And of course, the Nazi regime worked to create a strong nationalistic and Aryan identity, subsuming individual identities. So going back to the fire analogy, just as a pile of wood is not going to combust spontaneously, a crowd is not going to engage in violent behavior out of nowhere. You need the right social context, and you need charismatic and persuasive leaders who can light that spark and take advantage of that context at the right moment. A few years back, two social psychologists, Alexander Haslam and Stephen Reicher, introduced the concept of engaged followership. By studying crowd behavior in relations to certain types of leaders, they discovered that getting people to do violent things involves much more than a powerful figure just telling them what to do. According to their study, instead we tend to obey people when we identify with them. And likewise, we can be more easily persuaded to harm the people we do not identify with. And once we're engaged in a shared identity-based project, followers will creatively work towards the leader and actively engage in actions that serve the interest of the group they identify with. Therefore, true brutality involves active leadership, and it requires that you can actually draw people into something that seems meaningful to them. The Black Lives Matter movement, while decentralized, had strong symbolic leaders like George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and others who were victims of police violence. violence. And of course symbols such as the raised fist or the phrase, "I can't breathe." These symbols acted as focal points, galvanizing the movement and providing a clear message that could easily be adopted and spread by the crowds, and even across nations. Likewise, and obviously, the rioters of January 6th were largely influenced by figures such as Donald Trump, who they perceived as a symbol of a shared group identity. And this group identity was of course formed around certain political beliefs, perceptions of injustice, and a common narrative about the state of the US nation. The leaders in this case effectively used rhetoric and symbolism that resonated with this identity, thereby mobilizing and motivating the crowd into going much further than many of the key figures involved had probably expected. Like I said in the beginning of this video, you are a human being, and therefore you probably recognize the feeling of being dragged into the collective emotion of the crowd. This goes for both serious settings and more relaxed ones. And there's nothing to do about that, right? If you find yourself to be in a group of people, you're doomed. Trapped by your social surroundings, now you just have to accept the reality and follow the madness of the mob. Isn't that right? Well, of course not.
Everything begins with choice.
The thing is, just because there is a contagious and de-individuating effect of being among a group of people, it doesn't have to mean that you lose your sense of self entirely. In other words, you're still an individual and you still have a choice. Furthermore, to be able to retain your sense of identity and everything that goes with it is nothing else than a mental skill. And as any other skill, it can be acquired and sharpened through practice. And that is exactly what you should do. The next time you find yourself within a crowd, regardless of the specific setting, try to take one mental step back from whatever the crowd seems to be feeling or doing. Instead of just following the lead of everyone else, stop what you're doing and start observing the behavior of the people standing around you. Try listening to what they're saying and what they're yelling. By doing so, you train yourself to instinctively detach yourself from the collective consciousness of the crowd, and it will allow you to understand what might be going on in the mind of an individual who has lost its sense of identity and is blindly following the orders and persuasive words of a charismatic leader. The truth is, the future of mankind will bring with it destruction and tyranny. But the truth is also that one person cannot do this on his or her own. In order to achieve their totalitarian goals, tyrannic people have to persuade a critical mass of people that it is justified to take something away from someone else, be that fundamental rights, property, life, or dignity. And for you and I, by starting now, by practicing now while the consequences are still very small, at the local mall, at the football game, at the presidential rally, by effectively training yourself to instinctively retain your ability to act as an individual, you decrease the risk that you will be among the crowds that carry out this destruction. And in doing so, you might avoid becoming an instrument to totalitarianism. That's it, guys. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you didn't, make sure you leave a comment and tell me how I can improve. Also, if you have any opinion about this yourself, make sure to voice your opinion. Let's have a conversation. Let's have a debate. Remember to subscribe to my channel to show the algorithm and everybody else how important this conversation is. And otherwise, I'll see you in my next video.